Take a deep breath and tell me what's happening.
I cannot. I physically punished my daughter and she died.
Your daughter has died?
I killed my daughter. I killed my daughter.
How have you killed your daughter?
I beat her up. It wasn't my intention to kill her, but I beat her up too much.
The phone call that you've heard is absolutely chilling. It's the father basically calling the police to say that they have killed their daughter, or shall we say legally disciplined their daughter to a point where she dies, as if that is actually something that could ever be excused. But nonetheless, you're going to hear a lot of excuses as I describe this case and tell you the details of it. Also, it's worth noting that that phone call basically sparked an international manhunt for the perpetrators. Thank the Lord that those perpetrators were brought back to the UK and have faced justice. But essentially, it has caused an international storm. People all over the world are talking about the case of Sara Sharif, and they should be, because we are yet again talking about the fundamental requirement to have lessons learned so that other children don't die. But they do. I repeat on this channel again and again, the same ridiculous trope that's put out there, lessons will be learned. And yet here we are talking about one of the most gruesome, torturous cases regarding child murder that I think there has been in a very, very long time. And there is a frustration level here regarding the perpetrators, because one of the things that I always want to see where perpetrators are concerned is remorse. And there is an abject lack of remorse. I'm going to go through this in great detail. I need to do it justice. So if you have heard about this case, I would imagine that you won't have heard all of the details I'm going to tell you today. Also, if you are new to my channel and you like what you see, why don't you subscribe or give me a like, get your notifications on so you never miss an episode. To those of you who are following me on Patreon and also supporting me on YouTube membership, can't do this without you. Hope you're loving your full-length videos. More and more content will be coming to you. But as I said, let's talk about this case today and how horrific it is that in 2024, we can talk about a case where a parent believes that they have some kind of right to discipline a child to death. So let's go back to 2:47 a.m. on the 10th of August 2023. This is when Sara Sharif's father makes a call to the police non-emergency number 101 in the UK. Now that call lasted 8 minutes and 34 seconds, and boy, does Sharif feel sorry for himself. He's heard crying, whilst of course simultaneously confessing to killing his daughter, but throwing it in that it was legal discipline that led to her demise. He doesn't actually reveal his location, but then says that he's going to hand himself in to Woking police station, which is pretty ironic because what I'm going to tell you is that he wasn't anywhere near Woking at that point. Now, during this call, he asks the operator to write down his address, he spells out his postcode, and he tells them to send someone. Now, Sharif said that Sara had been naughty over the last 3 to 4 weeks, just let that sink in, naughty, and he was giving her punishment to sort her out. And he stated, as you'll have heard, I did legally punish my daughter and she died. Now, I don't know about you, I've heard a lot of sentences, but I've never heard a father say, I did legally punish my daughter and she died, because I think we can all agree that in the UK, you don't get to legally kill anyone. It just doesn't happen. And certainly not a child. He also suggested it wasn't his intention to kill her, but that obviously he beat her up too much. She was naughty, and now he's talking about beating her up too much to the point where she's dead. Now, like I said, he says he's going to hand himself into Woking police station, so it's pretty surprising when the police trace that call to Islamabad in Pakistan. Just going to throw it out there, hardly a 5-minute walk away. Now, it turns out that he isn't alone. He's with Batool and Malik, who've also fled to Pakistan the day after murdering Sara. That phone call was actually made 1 hour after they landed. So like I said, at that point, doesn't sound like he's going to hand himself in. It sounds like he hot-footed it to a whole different country, a whole different continent, to avoid actually being brought to justice. Also, they took the other 5 children, and those 5 children were aged between 1 and 13 with them. So I'm going to say that is pretty planned, calculated and premeditated when it comes to making a choice to, shall we say, vacate the area where you are obviously going to be in trouble for your actions. Now, at this point, it goes national and international because Sara's death is really widely reported. You've got the BBC covering it, Sky News, etc., all the major newspapers. It becomes this massive international case, and rightly so. And what personally, as far as I'm concerned, psychologically really sparks people's consciousness with this case is because what happened to Sara in her short life was horrific. And also, it has laid bare some unbelievably concerning issues. So I want to go back in time. I want to go back to the very, very beginning, essentially. In fact, pre-Sara even being born, because literally, Sara was made the subject of a child protection plan as soon as she was born. That was in January 2013. And the reason for that is because they had concerns that she was going to be at risk of harm from her father, Urfan Sharif, the guy who's calling the police and saying, oh, basically, I was just legally disciplining my child and now she's dead. Yeah, before she was born, they were worried about this guy. Also, they were worried about the mother, Olga Numin, and apparently she had got some learning difficulties and her parenting, shall we say, wasn't to the ideal standard. So the family were known to social services, they were known to the police before Sara was even born, and police had been involved with the family at least 4 times between May 2010 and August 2012, and Surrey County Council's Children's Services were also in contact with the family from 2010. There were lots of concerns that had been raised about the family, so supervision of Sara's siblings, the fact that they were living in completely inhospitable conditions for children, the family home was meant to be pretty disgusting, and they were said to be suffering from a range of different emotional and physical abuse that was to do really with the poor relationship between both of the parents. And in 2012, on one occasion, there was a child who, in the documents, is referred to as Z for legal reasons, because obviously they deserve anonymity. They had suffered physical harm during an altercation. That same sibling was literally found alone in a shop that same year. They were 3. 3. Found wandering in a shop by themselves. Who is not swooping in to remove these children immediately? I mean, 3-year-olds should not be anywhere by themselves, but they shouldn't be on a street getting into a shop by themselves. I mean, that is neglect on the highest level. Now, a year later, Z was also found unsupervised in Woking Town Centre. So essentially, they're just wandering around with no care, no supervision, no parenting at all. Now, there was an application made for a care order in December 2012. And at this point, the family are actually living in temporary accommodation. So it's homeless accommodation in Slough. And before that, they had lived in a 1-bedroom rented flat. And essentially, one of the things that was noted by the people who came to inspect that was all of them were sharing one bed. So ultimately, there wasn't an opportunity for children to have any privacy or a separate experience to the parents because they didn't have room. The rest of the house was just laid bare. There wasn't anything that was child appropriate. There was nothing that suggested there was a child-centric point of view and position in that house. Now, at this point, understandably, and rightfully so, the local authority bring care proceedings for the children. This is, by the way, 7 days before Sara is born. The notes that were made said, there have also been allegations that the children have been subject to physical abuse by both parents. The children have been exposed to domestic violence. Why have the children been left there this long? I have no idea. You know, I get it's a balance. It's a balance to keep families together, and it's an understandable trauma when children are separated from families, and we appreciate that you have to make a call as to what is going to be the most harmful. But when there is domestic abuse, neglect and emotional abuse of this level, I just cannot compute why they are left. Now, on the 17th of January 2013, as I said, this is 6 days after Sara's birth, the first hearing for care proceedings for the children concluded. And this is what was noted. Whilst the guardian is satisfied that there may be reasonable grounds to believe that the children are likely to suffer significant harm, the advantages of the children remaining at home should be weighed against the potential harm to the children of removal, particularly to Sara as a newborn child, before we have a full assessment and understanding of these children and their parents' ability to meet their individual needs. Well, I'm just going to throw it out there. If there is a significant risk of harm to the children, get them out. No one should have a report where it is suggesting there could be significant harm to the child, and they're saying, but you know what? It could also be pretty upsetting if they get removed from home. And also, newborns being removed from home, probably the best outcome when it comes down to living in a very abusive situation, because they offer concurrent adoption in the UK, meaning that a child can end up being fostered by parents who will eventually adopt them, meaning that the attachment issue is not going to be too much of a problem. So it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Keeping families together is only okay when the family deserves to be kept together. Now, months later, in May 2013, that same sibling, Zed, ends up getting burned by an iron. Social workers do go round, and aside from seeing that there is an injury there, they also notice that the house is not fit for purpose. There's no light bulbs in the house. There's no bedding in the children's bedrooms. It's just not appropriate, and it shows that there is a complete lack of care. Yet in spite of that, in September that year, it's agreed that the children should remain in the care of their parents. It makes no sense whatsoever, but I'm just going to go through exactly what happened and played out to show you the systemic failures. So Sharif and Damin sign an agreement with social workers, and this says that they're going to, quote, fully engage in a 10-week parenting course, and they're not going to use any physical abuse or, shall we say, chastisement on the children. Also, they had to ensure that the children couldn't get out, be found wandering in shops or in the town centre without any parental supervision. And the children at that point were placed under a 12-month supervision order. But this begs the question, what do you actually have to do to have your children taken into care? Because they have done pretty much everything that is highly inappropriate and demonstrates their lack of ability as parents at that point, and yet they're still keeping their children, even though it has been noted there is a risk of significant harm to those children. Now, Sara does get taken into foster care. That's for the first time in November 2014, and she's almost 2 at this point. And the reason for that is because Z, who's the sibling who obviously has been found wandering and there's been issues with scolding, etc., they complain that Domin, mother in this case, had bitten them hard. Now, there was an emergency protection order for the 3 children that same month, and it's reported at this point that Zed was distressed, that they were shaking, and this was whenever they were picked up by Domin, the mother. And the child was apparently recorded saying things like, I don't want to go home, mummy hits. And the previous day, Zed, the same child, was actually seen to tell another one of their siblings, who was known as You in the papers, that the man is going to hit us now and stop, or the man will hit you. So we can see that there is abuse constantly going on in that home. Now, Sara was in a separate placement from the siblings. Apparently, she would be seen standing against the wall, facing it. So that's really unusual and atypical behaviour. It would be behaviour that you'd expect a child who's totally disengaged or who has been punished to a degree where they just go and stand looking at the wall because they're afraid of consequences. And social workers also said that she was really small, she was really thin. And they noted that her eating habits were a bit problematic. She didn't eat a lot. She struggled with that human interaction. I've worked with children in the past during my work with children who were horribly abused, and some of the kids that I worked with, when I was doing work that would involve us playing out different kinds of therapeutic interaction, I will use a certain amount of appropriate touch because I want to see how children will respond in those situations. And it's really distressing when you will place, for example, a hand on the shoulder of a child and you're just intonating to them that they're safe, and their head just drops and they just hang their shoulders and there is no connection there because they're afraid or it's never happened. So they don't know how to engage with that. And in this case, it's noted that Sara didn't respond to being carried or didn't wrap her legs around her carer, so doesn't have those normal cues and experiences that a child should exhibit and a child should expect, essentially. Now, apparently, the lawyer who was working for Surrey Council said that they were really concerned about all of these things and they felt that the abuse was carrying on constantly. This certainly wasn't something that had just happened on one occasion, and they felt that there were all these allegations, including the fact that Sharif had apparently hit one of the children in 2011 and 2012. So there was an emergency protection order in November 2014. And in that, it's noted quote, there would be significant concerns if the children returned to the independent care of Mr. Sharif, given the history of allegations of physical abuse of the children and domestic abuse with Mr. Sharif as the perpetrator. It went on to say, no assessment has been carried out of Mr. Sharif as a single primary. However, a parenting assessment of the parents in the last court proceedings did raise concerns about Mr. Sharif's parenting capacity. So all of this should mean that somebody like Sharif doesn't get anywhere near his kids, at least not unless it is supervised. But of course, I wouldn't be telling this story if those kind of obvious foundations actually meant that these children had been protected, that those reports had been taken seriously. But I'm telling this story because clearly they weren't. And that's because both Sara and the sibling that's noted down as you in the reports were actually returned to her parents, but Zed remained in foster care. Now, whilst Zed was actually in foster care, they made allegations of physical abuse by both the parents. They also said there was a lot of domestic violence between the parents, and this was of course denied by Sharif and Domin. The court apparently did not determine the truth. So again, it's obviously introduced and they're saying, oh well, we don't know whether it happened or otherwise. These two people are saying it hasn't occurred, so therefore how can we determine whether it did? Well, I think because historically you've got a lot of evidence that seems to suggest Sharif and even the mother in this case, aren't the best people to be bringing up those children. Now in 2015, this is in the middle of the care proceedings hearing, it's worth noting that Sharif was accused of domestic abuse by Domin. She said that he hit her, he hit the kids, he was really controlling, he was really possessive, he was really violent. They weren't actually tested in court, but at that point Sharif did agree to go on a course which was meant to help him with his domestic violence issues. And why would you go on a course like that unless you were guilty? So I would say that absolutely stands up. But he then said, well, it's not just me, Domin's like that as well. So then you have this he said, she said issue with both parents essentially looking bad regarding the treatment towards one another and to the children. So at this point, Sara's once again taken really briefly into foster care, and then she ends up joining her mum in a refuge. Now, whilst in foster care, one of the carers who was looking after Sara said that one of the things that really concerned them was they had scars on their body. These are children, and they had scars all over them. They had scars that they believed were consistent with cigarette burns, and the way that the parents excused these marks was to say that they were chicken pox. Also, Sara's behaviour was just not typical for a child her age, and they were really disturbed by her actions because it seemed like she was really struggling emotionally. And all of this is the backdrop to why these children should have been kept in foster care, but that didn't happen because in November that year, the family court concluded that the children should live with Domin and should also have supervised visits with Sharif. So their safety certainly wasn't the primary in this situation. Then we get to 2019, March of that year. It turns out that the children are no longer going to live with Domin. In fact, they're going to move in with Sharif and his wife Batool full time. This is the guy who everyone knows is violent as a perpetrator towards children and towards partners. But hey, why should that stop him getting custody of his kids? Now, Sharif claimed this happened because Sara allegedly said that Domin was abusing her. So that's why he now believes he should step in as the hero and take care of the children. The documents said that Sara had apparently reported that her mother had slapped her and pulled her hair, and that she'd also tried to drown her, which would be utterly terrifying if that were the truth. She also suggested her mother had tried to burn her and that she'd pinched her. Again, these allegations were not tested in court, but nonetheless, in May, Sharif and Batool applied with Domin, who's the mother in this case's consent, for Sara and her siblings to live with them. So there was a report that was ordered by the family court on Sara's welfare, and the council recorded that Sara had disclosed physical assaults by Domin, and then concluded that apparently the mother had low capacity to meet Sara's needs. I agree with that, she did, but that doesn't mean that she should go and live with the father. In fact, I would say that it would be far better for her to remain in foster care. But instead, the recommendation is that Sara should live with Sharif and Batool and should have supervised contact once a fortnight with Domin. It's mind-blowing, this, because we know he has been noted as a violent perpetrator. He is somebody who has been considered at significant risk of harming the children, and yet off you go. Go and have your new life with your violent father. Now, a judge actually agreed with that report, saying that they should go and live with Sharif and Batool, and that Batool was going to supervise these visits and it was going to be amazing. And at a hearing in Guildford Family Court on the 9th of October 2019, literally, the judge was just praising Batool. She's just an incredible person, that she's going to supervise these visits, and that she's amazing. Literally, if you look at the history of the father and the biological mother in this case, they likely should not be near children. I'm sorry, they likely should not, because the reality is their behaviour has been dangerous and you shouldn't get several chances where children are concerned, but they did. Now, Batool told the judge that Domin's children, quote, hated their mother and called her Shrek and Ogre, which to me is straight from the mouths of Batool, not the kids. The idea that the kids are saying that my mum's Shrek or Ogre is just not true. When you speak to children, even children who've been horribly abused, one of the big problems that you have is the loyalty index that they feel for their parents. Even though the mother might be awful, they will often see that person as their primary carer who they love against all odds. The idea that they're going to the stepmom, and we all know stepmother and father relationships can be deeply problematic. I get it. There are amazing ones out there. I live with an amazing man who is an amazing stepfather. But you know what? It's not easy because there are points of conflict. The way you raise your children may be slightly different to the way they imagine children should be raised, and so on and so forth. And you feel as the primary biological parent, they shouldn't have the same rights as you have when it comes down to your children because they're yours. So all of these things are why stepfamilies break down at a higher rate than biologically connected families. It's just reality. But the idea that stepmom, who's relatively new in these children's lives, is getting the investment of these kids who are now telling her that they hate the biological mother and that they want to think of her as Shrek and an Ogre, it just speaks of being made up by Batool. Now, the judge actually said to Domin, it would be good if you could at least be courteous to her, meaning Batool, to be polite to her, to be slightly grateful even to her, because without her, I don't know how we're going to get this contact keeping going, to be honest. Well, I don't know about you, Judge. Maybe at a supervised visit centre. How about that? Maybe don't just believe what Batool's saying. How about that? Maybe don't hand back the kids to an abusive man. How about that? There you go, 3 suggestions that would have had far better outcomes. Now, 5 months later, during this period of time where she's amazing and she's incredible and she's just keeping these great meetings going and everything's just hunky-dory, she's actually texting her sister that Sharif had, quote, beat the crap out of Sara, and she actually sent pictures of Sara's injuries. And bear in mind, less than 4 years later, Sara was dead. So that's the background of what we're talking about today. And that's from before birth to the present moment. And before birth, they believed she needed protecting. How on earth did she end up dead at the hands that they already knew she needed to be protected from? Let's talk about Sara. So she was born on the 11th of January 2013. She was born in Slough. Slough is an area of Berkshire. Made famous, I believe, by the poem by John Betjeman. I believe the first verse goes, come friendly bombs and fall on Slough. It isn't fit for humans now. There isn't grass to graze a cow swum over death. So even though I'm not convinced it's really that awful, because I think John Betjeman was just selecting any area that was modern, the point is, when you think about Slough, it conjures the Office series in the UK. And as I said, not necessarily the most beautiful landscape. Apologies to any of you who live in Slough, by the way. I have been. It's not awful at all. But I'm just throwing it out there in case people have heard of Slough because of the infamy of The Office and also John Betjeman, who was our poet laureate for a period of time. Now, Sara's mother was Olga Domin. She was a Polish Catholic woman. And the father, who is just genuinely one of the worst human beings that I've ever come across, he's called Urfan Sharif. He was 41. He was a taxi driver. He moved from Jhelum, Pakistan to the UK in 2001. And they basically met shortly after Sharif moved to the UK. Apparently, they met working in a Burger King. Olga and Sharif then got married in 2009, but it didn't last that long. They got divorced in 2015. Sara also had a brother, and he was born in 2010. Now, before the parents split up, one of the things that people say about Sara was that she was a really bright, chatty child. She was one of those kids that just loved the great outdoors. She was always outside. She was doing well in school. But when the parents divorced, as there is usually a trauma to some degree when parents divorce, even when you have the best co-parenting situation, even when you get on really well with your ex, it's a big change for children when you're not living in the same house. I've been through a divorce, and even though my children are wonderful, adjusted, beautiful children who have grown into incredible men, it's not easy, and it causes certain scars, and it's very challenging. And so you can appreciate that divorce in itself is going to create some kind of foundational issues in their childhood that have some fractures within it. But I would say, to add to that, there's a lot of tension within the divorce over the religious upbringing and the cultural expectations and the differing parenting styles, and these problems become more pronounced. Now, I am going to say this and I'm going to offend somebody. So if I'm offending you, I'm really sorry, but I speak my truth on this channel, not necessarily the truth that everybody wants to hear. If you are a Pakistani Muslim male, don't marry a Polish non-Muslim woman if you want your kids to be Muslim. Unless she has specifically said she's going to convert. I have got a friend who did that. I appreciate people do it. Crack on. That works for you. Works for you. If that hasn't been discussed, if that's not the case, back off with what you think that child needs to do and be in the UK. Because in the UK, that's not our culture. You can have your culture, but you shouldn't enforce it on children who come from a relationship where there is a non-Muslim and a Muslim. Particularly as well because in the UK, it tends to be that the female line is the religion that's followed. So essentially, I have a real problem when you have an individual who marries a non-Muslim and then insists on the children being brought up in an orthodox way. It just isn't fair. Now, as I've said, in 2019, the children are awarded to Sharif. They end up moving to Horsell in Woking, and at this point they're living with Sharif, his wife, Beinash Batool, she's 29, so there's quite a considerable age difference there, and the couple's 4 children, and also Sharif's brother, Faisal Malik, he's 29, so again, he's younger than Sharif. So Sharif should be the most mature person and the most experienced person in that family. It's just a shame that really all he is a power-hungry predator. Now, despite the fact that both the parents have got equal rights to see the children, it becomes more and more difficult to maintain over time. And the mother in this case doesn't end up having a lot of contact with her children in Woking. But what she does say is, I really am objecting to you trying to bring my children up as Muslim. That is not something I'm okay with. But of course, her beliefs are completely ignored. So essentially, even though she is saying, I don't want this, you're in the UK, that's not what I'm bought into, they just ignore her. And they decide that that's what they're going to do. Now, the records indicate that that visitation that was meant to occur just was really problematic. And the mother in this case said that she felt sidelined, she felt very worried about Sara's welfare, and in particular, when they transitioned to Woking, she felt that Sara was now in an environment at home that was increasingly isolated, that was very culturally insular, and that basically limited people seeing what was happening from the outside in. And there are a range of reasons we'll go through regarding why that's the fact. Now, in April 2023, Sara ends up getting taken out of primary school. And the reason that is given for this is she's being bullied for wearing the hijab. Now, I don't believe that for 1 minute. It was just an excuse. And also, you know what? There are people in the UK who are really negative towards the burqa, the hijab, etc. And those individuals have their reasons. But for the most part, we just accept. We just accept what you want to wear, what you want to believe in, what you want to practice religiously. As long as you don't expect everyone to respect you, as long as you don't expect everybody to believe what you believe, it's cool. I have a deep faith in God. Some people think I'm mad for that. And that's fine. That's the beauty of the UK. You can offend me or not offend me. Nothing's going to happen to you if that's the case, because that's the UK. So I do not believe for 1 minute that she's being bullied for wearing the hijab. I believe that the parents just want her out of school so they can carry on doing the awful things that they're doing to her. And homeschooling is a perfect excuse to hide the child from eyes that are going to be concerned about what's happening to that kid because they're turning up with bruises and so on and so forth. And that's another thing that is really upsetting about this case, because I would say in the UK right now, the government are trying to intonate that children who are homeschooled can be horribly abused by these parents and no one knows about it. Well, actually, the legislation on homeschooling is that the LEA should be involved. So you should be able to homeschool your child safely, and also there should be some overseeing by the local authority. And you can't criticise parents who are homeschooling because a lot of them are doing an amazing job, and also children get killed all the time who aren't homeschooled. So it's kind of being peddled as an excuse to be a bit more strong-armed over education in the UK, which is another thing that is really bad because it's just a nanny state when we start telling parents what they can and can't do. But understandably, when you are a predator, it's really helpful if you can get your child out of school because there's no support for that child and no one's prying into your business. Now, as I've said, going back to when Sara was discovered at 2:50 a.m. on the 10th of August 2023, at this point the police have been called to the address on Hammond Road because they've had the call about him admitting he's killed his daughter. When they get there, the property is basically really quiet. One thing that they noted was it's very tidy, but it's seemingly completely empty. And they don't know what they're going to discover at this point because it could be a hoax. So they start to look around to find out what's happened in the home. And then sadly, they do discover Sara's body in a bunk bed. When they took notes from the scene, investigators said, first of all, there was just an absence of family members. There was also an absence of personal belongings. So that means that they'd had a hasty departure and made sure that they'd taken the family effects that they need. The forensic teams also commented that they were really struck by the stark contrast between the outward neatness of the home and the horrific violence that Sara had endured. And believe me, I have covered abuse cases so often, and the injuries and the abuse that this child has gone through is absolutely up there with the worst I have ever heard. They also found a note, and that note was in Sharif's handwriting. It was tucked under one of the pillows near Sara's head, and it said, "Whoever see this note, it's me, Urfan Sharif, who killed my daughter by beating. I'm running away because I'm scared, but I promise that I will hand over myself and take punishment. I swear to God that my intention was not to kill her, but I lost it. My daughter is Muslim. Can you bury her like Muslim may be? I will be back before you finish the post-mortem." Absolutely bizarre note. Also, back off from saying, "Can you bury her like Muslim maybe," which is literally in bad English what he wrote. Because you are somebody who's murdered your child. You don't then get to dictate how that child is laid to rest. The mother in this case may want to choose a completely different kind of ritual. But I also appreciate that for those of you who are listening who are Muslim, it is incredibly important for you to ensure that the burial happens very quickly, and also it's without a coffin and they are placed in a certain way because of Mecca. So I appreciate that it's very, very important if you are actually a practicing Muslim to make sure that these things play out. Also, there is a problem because when there is a murder, that's not possible, just because the body has to be kept whilst they do the analysis. So it's very conflicting, of course, for Muslim families who end up losing somebody to murder when they have these strong beliefs and they require to have their child or their parent back to them so they can go through with these rituals. And it can't happen because you have pathologists who need to look at things and need to store certain things. But like I said, I think in this case, it's back off from saying how you want your child laid to rest. You killed your child. You ain't got no rights anymore. And this suggestion that they want to face the consequences, but actually we're running off to Pakistan, doesn't really make sense to me. Now, the handwriting experts and the criminal psychologists who looked at this said that the note basically indicated panic, guilt, and also an attempt to shape the narrative before the body was discovered by authorities. So essentially what they're saying is, listen, they did this quickly and they're trying at that moment in time to go, oh, how can we frame this in a way that makes us look not quite as bad as the people that we truly are? Let's say we didn't mean to do it. It was just discipline. I feel really bad about this. I'm not running away, even though I'm running away. And I will be back to face the consequences, but hey, I don't know when. So it's trying to shape this narrative. And the religious references, the burial request, that kind of gives you an insight into Sharif's mindset. So he's trying to preserve some cultural rights for his daughter, despite his horrific actions, which is just blindsiding to me. Now, on the 15th of August, the post-mortem was carried out by Dr. Nathaniel Carey, and it was horrific. Sara had more than 70 new external injuries. 70 new external injuries, not old ones, no ones that had healed, they were new. This is as well as numerous older injuries, and that indicates that there was a very long sustained period of abuse. Also, and I am sorry to describe it this way, I have to describe it this way because this is what was seen and noted, but I also know that each and every one of you who's listening to me right now is thinking about Sara, this beautiful little girl, and I'm describing what happened to her body, and I know it is unspeakably evil and devastating to hear. So she had a gaping puncture wound to her head, as well as signs of being hit by an elongated object below her belly button. She had 11 fractures to her spine. She had burns to her buttocks that was caused by domestic iron. She had 6 probable human bite marks. She also had signs of a traumatic brain injury. And the cause of her death was actually stated as complications arising from multiple injuries and neglect. So they concluded that Sara had died on the 8th of August 2023, so that's about 2 days before her body was actually found. Now, the forensic pathologist publicly commented that the scale and the duration of the injuries were among the worst seen in recent child abuse cases. So that is giving you an indicator of the severity of those injuries. The worst seen in recent child abuse cases. And the combination of both the fresh and the healing injuries clearly showed the ongoing violence over the weeks, if not for much longer. And I think we can all safely agree it was for much longer, because this child should have been taken into protective custody a long time ago, because they were safeguarding her before she was born, because they believed this guy was highly abusive. Now, Olga Damin, the mother, she actually had to identify little Sara's body, and she described that experience of going to have to do that as devastating. She said that she could literally barely recognise her little girl because of the extent of the abuse. When she went to identify, she was dressed in Mickey Mouse pyjamas. She said one of her cheeks was swollen and the other side was really bruised. She said, even now, when I close my eyes, I can see what my baby looked like. And that's going to be her memory forever. That's going to be the last time she saw her baby girl, in those Mickey Mouse childish pyjamas, which is such a juxtaposition to the horrific injuries this little girl sustained. It is just such a polarity. You're dealing with the broken, beaten body of this little girl dressed in Mickey Mouse pyjamas. Now, as I said, the police were investigating straight away from the moment that they heard that phone call, and they were able to trace that call to Islamabad in Pakistan, because Sharif, Batool and Malik had immediately fled to Pakistan literally the day after murdering Sara. So much for I'm going to go to Woking police station and I'll be back before the actual post-mortem. The phone call was actually made 1 hour after they landed. So they didn't even tell the police until after they'd safely got to a whole nother country. As I said, they'd even taken their other 5 children who were aged between 1 and 13. Now, the analyst noted Sharif's attempt to basically justify the actions that he carried out. So he said legal punishment. And this totally reveals that he had a majorly distorted view of discipline. And the fact that they took that immediate departure, they bought tickets on short notice, they took all the children with them, that indicates a lot of planning. It also obviously indicates a desire to evade swift justice. Now, 2 weeks after Sara's murder, the police start appealing to people in the Woking community and also beyond who'd had any contact with Sara, who hadn't maybe come forward at that point. They said they were working to try to piece together a picture of Sara's lifestyle. So at this point, they also released pictures of Sara's father, stepmom and uncle. And it was effective. There was a lot of people who came forward, so information from ex-neighbours, former classmates, parents, community members, all of these who had actually notably observed changes in Sara's demeanour, or also seen suspicious incidents. And lots of organisations also came out to say, listen, if you've got any information about this child, we need to work together as a community, as organisations, to talk about what could have contributed to this child's demise. It doesn't matter what your information is, doesn't matter how small it may seem, come forward and speak it. Also, there was an international manhunt for Sharif, Batool and Malik. This is launched because obviously they've fled, and the UK authorities actually collaborated with the National Crime Agency, Interpol, and Pakistani officials. Now, the police in Pakistan, apparently they were pretty unhappy with the pressure they were feeling because they were being highlighted in the international news as maybe not being that effective initially, and British authorities were saying you need to find these murderers, essentially. Also, at that point, a new High Commissioner, somebody called Jane Marriott, had begun her post in Islamabad in July, so she was pushing them very regularly for results on this case. That's her new job. She wants to make damn sure the perpetrators are brought back to justice. Now, the search was complicated because there isn't actually a formal extradition treaty between the UK and Pakistan, so there isn't any real legal ramifications on the Pakistani government if they choose not to actually send these individuals back. Now, it was discovered that Sharif, Batool and Malik had landed at Islamabad airport early on the 10th of August. That was where Sharif actually made the call to the authorities. Then they're collected by family members and they're then driven to Jhelum, which is over 81 miles away. Apparently spent about 2 days at Sharif's family home before 11 p.m. on the 12th of August when they moved to Sharif's sister's home, and they apparently went there just for a few hours. Now, Saeed Kurram Ali, who's the regional police chief with the Punjab police, they stated that his brother-in-law, as in Sharif's brother-in-law, said that they were leaving the house at 5 a.m. And he said, I asked them, you came in at 12 in the night, now you're leaving so quickly. And they apparently said, we have some important things to do, but they didn't actually explain what they had to do. And he said, when we asked the family what was the reason for the visit, they said, oh, they've just come over for a routine visit. So basically the family are lying. Let's just call it as it is. The family are lying to the authorities and trying to protect the individuals who are responsible for a child's death. Now, from that point, the police didn't know where they had gone, so there were additional searches going on, and Pakistani authorities conducted extensive raids. They also did a lot of field inquiries, and they spoke to a lot of local informants because these people are the individuals who know what's going on the street. But it was really hard because basically cultural and clan loyalties created a really challenging environment for law enforcement. So when I'm talking about cultural and clan loyalties, it's where it really doesn't matter what's happened. If you're related to somebody or you belong to that small community of people who have loyalty to one another, even if you've done the worst thing in the world, they're just not going to speak to the authorities because their loyalty lies with you and not with the horror of your actions, essentially. Therefore, they're not going to go and speak to the police to turn you over because, essentially, like I said, they care for you more than the horror you've inflicted on somebody else. Now, one of the things that we know is that there was a 5-day gap. So the police in Punjab started their search for the family on the 15th of August. This is after they get a request from Interpol through Pakistan's Federal Investigation Agency. And that's 5 days after Sara's body had been found. Now, I don't know why there was that 5-day gap, but essentially once they start searching, they really were going out of their way to find out where these individuals were. They may not have used the most ethical methods, I will say that, but they were certainly determined to find these perpetrators. Now, Surrey police, who've obviously got a big job to do because they are dealing with people who've fled internationally, they told the press that they've been liaising with international partners since the 10th of August, but they didn't reveal when they put the actual request to Interpol to ask Pakistan's police to search the family. So it could just be that that's the delay. Pakistani police said that they pulled a team together to begin the search on the 16th of August. There was a hell of a lot of bureaucratic red tape. There was a hell of a lot of coordination hurdles. And also, because of that absence of a direct extradition treaty, it was quite complicated where swift action was concerned. And that delay really did spark a massive conversation internationally about the need for faster international cooperation in urgent child murder cases. So to some degree, that's been helpful because people are saying we need to act really quickly in these cases because essentially these people who have acted in such an illegal and immoral manner may be able to get ahead and get away and hide, possibly forever, because we were slow to get off the mark in searching for them. Now, like I said, the police were very committed to bringing back these individuals to the UK, but the tactics that they used were probably not in line with how we would act where our investigations are going on in the UK. Because in Jhelum, the police, first of all, did begin to offer a reward for the suspects, which is helpful, money does talk. And they put all these wanted posters out there, and then they do really good detective work. So they go house to house inquiring about whether anybody's seen these people. They actually raided over 20 properties in their search. But I would say they also got a bit of notoriety and came under some fire because they were apparently using unconstitutional colonial tactics. And the reason for this is, in their desire to find the perpetrators, they also detained Sharif's two brothers, Imran and Sara Sharif. They also detained their brother-in-law, Usman Chowdhury, and they also went to an unknown location to try to force Sharif and company out of hiding. So let's say it wasn't necessarily as we would act in the UK in investigations, but I think they were very desperate to make sure that international people were looking into Pakistan and seeing that as a police force they were doing everything they could. And with respect, whatever works, I would say. Now, Sharif's father, Mohammed Sharif, he did say, listen, I did see my son when he arrived in Pakistan, but I have no idea where they were. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm calling BS. He's a liar. Of course he knows where his son is. He also said it was an accidental death. You know, it's an accidental death. I mean, if I don't know every other day about all of these accidental deaths just happening to kids, I don't know whether I'm in the UK. Accidental death, a drowning. Accidental death, a horrible house fire. Accidental death, falls out of a tree on their head. Awful. Accidental. Accidental death, not being beaten to a pulp and having a gaping hole in your head. That's not an accidental death. In the UK, unlike obviously in Pakistan, that's known as a murder. Or in America, it's known as a homicide. It's not accidental because somebody else caused it. And it really annoys me that this guy who's going, I don't know where my son is, but I do know it's an accidental death. A little bit convenient on the information there, aren't you? Just a little bit convenient. It's an accidental death and I've no idea where the perpetrator is, but just be aware, it was just accidental. He didn't really do anything wrong. It is really frustrating because it demonstrates the lack of care and consideration for this young girl, and it also speaks to me culturally of how women are valued in certain places in the world and even to a degree in the UK, because Sara's female. And I'm afraid, like it or otherwise, culturally, females in certain cultures just don't stack up in importance as males do. Now, the police are obviously desperate to find the perpetrators. And at this point, the father is also suggesting that he wants his son to hand himself into the police. He wants them to fight the case. He also said in the media that the police are harassing my family. They've arrested my other sons and son-in-law. He said, we are confined in our house and the relatives have abandoned us. I urge Urfan, Batool and Faisal, which are the first names of the perpetrators, to hand themselves over to the police. We have nothing to do with the crime. Crime? Is it a crime? Well, it's not really a crime. It's just an accidental death. But you just said crime. Yeah, actually, I did say crime. Can we just rewind that? No, because you're right. It is a crime, meaning you're aware it is a crime. Also, it was said that the police confiscated the Sharif family's vehicles, so it restricted their movement. Now, I get it. That's all unethical, and I understand that must have been deeply frustrating for a family who aren't guilty of doing anything. But I guess the police were just really desperate to make sure that if they had those vehicles, it would mean that if those individuals they're looking for wanted to flee, it would be more difficult for them, because I think that they simply did not believe that the family members didn't know where the perpetrators were. Now, Geelong police in the end ended up detaining 10 of Sharif's relatives. They were very serious about, shall we say, putting the screws on this family to make them come forward if they had information. And apparently they did begin making further threats to go after the women in the family in order to basically increase the pressure on Sharif coming out of hiding. Osama Malik, who's an international criminal law expert, who's based in Islamabad, they said that the police's plan to issue a reward was a preferable method for tracking them down, saying this tactic is certainly better than the unconstitutional colonial tactics the Geelong police is currently using by detaining Pakistani members of Urfan's family who have nothing to do with the incident in the UK. They may have had nothing to do with the incident in the UK, but they shouldn't have allowed those individuals into their home in light of what they'd done, but they did. They allowed them in. They got themselves involved. And so, you know, whatever works to make sure these perpetrators and predators end up back in the UK justice system, as far as I'm concerned. That same lawyer said, in Pakistani villages and small towns, politics is still based on patronage and clan loyalties. Local politically influential clan members usually get involved in negotiations between police and fugitives, as is the case in this saga that has been running for a month. Pakistani police are notoriously known for torture and even extrajudicial killings, which are known as, quote, encounters in local parlance. This reputation would likely make it difficult for Urfan and his family members to trust the police and surrender to them. So basically the lawyer is saying Sharif and the other perpetrators are at risk of being murdered in one of these, shall we say, encounters with the police, and therefore they don't trust that if they give themselves over, they're going to be sent back to the UK. They think they might die. Now, international human rights groups got involved. They said that they were really concerned about the fairness of Pakistani police methods, and they urged the adherence to the rule of law. And the British High Commission, they also quietly encouraged Pakistani authorities to avoid practices that might undermine any future legal proceedings in the UK. Personally, I think, why is anybody who's working in human rights giving a crap about 3 people who've been involved in the torture and murder of a child? Why have they got any human rights? I'm so tired of the upside down, inside out world I live in, where these absolute lunatics who do the most horrendous things are backed by middle class idiots who think that everybody should be treated with respect. Everybody should be treated with dignity. Everybody should be given human rights, even when they've stolen everybody else's human rights around them. I mean, at the end of the day, why don't we just invite everybody into the party at the same level, believing that everyone is as good as one another, even when you have a history of horror involved with a particular individual? But hey, let's care about the people who are fugitives and not the child who was found beaten to death in a bunk bed. We get to the 6th of September 2023. At this point, the BBC has sent this unbelievably egotistical, arrogant video. It's from an unverified account, so they can't trace it. It's 2 minutes and 36 seconds long, and as you will see, it literally speaks volumes about these perpetrators. Because you've got Batool there. She's reading from that notebook saying what she says. Sharif is there, who doesn't speak, of course. Doesn't touch on Sara's death. Just calls it an incident. Now again, incident. Let me give you an example of an incident. Oh my God, I was eating my burger. I've got a bit of ketchup on my leg. Ruined my new pants. Bit of an incident. I've had a bit of a bump in my car. It was one of those things. I was looking, person was going a little bit fast. I've crashed into them. It was an incident. Need to get insurance sorting it. An incident is not a child being found beaten to death in a bunk bed. It's not an incident. An incident is a bit of an issue, not a murder. But Batool doesn't get that memo, and all Batool is concerned about is her own safety. They're saying basically as a group that the Pakistani police are harassing them, they're illegally detaining their family members, they're raiding their homes, and they're now in hiding because they're fearful for their own lives. Well, maybe if you hadn't allowed a child to be murdered, you wouldn't be fearful of your lives and for your lives at all. But apparently they think the police are going to torture and kill them. And they make it clear at the end of the video that they are willing to cooperate with UK authorities, and they do want to fight their case in court, because even though they're horrendous individuals who've left the UK to try to flee, now it's getting a little bit hot under the collar and they're realising there's international attention. You know, maybe Pakistan ain't the place for such felons. Now, in response, Jhelum Police Chief Mahmood Badwa said that the allegations of harassment and torture were basically false, and said, listen, if you've got any fears from the police, you can go to the court and you can just seek protection. And Mudassar Khan, who's another spokesperson for the Jhelum police, they said, we deny the allegations made by Beinash Batool in her video. But they also go on to say that that appearance, that video, shows that they're absolutely aware that the police are looking for them, and therefore the police do have an obligation to act. And they say, you know, you need to come forward. They said that the 3 police teams are working on finding them. Apparently they had made several raids across Jhelum and Mapur to get them. And basically they were giving a message saying that we are hopeful we're going to arrest them soon. They don't want to torture and kill them. You've got human rights organisations already batting on about how you've got to be careful around these things and you've got to look after these felons. So the eyes of the world are on them. The police are not going to do anything that's going to make it amplified in a negative way for them. Now, that particular video demonstrates, again, this strategic attempt to get sympathy. So Batool is basically getting the Pakistani authorities to be seen as villains and making out that we're good people, we want to face trial in the UK. But really what they want is to go back because they're getting afraid of what might happen to them in Pakistan. That's it. It's got nothing to do with wanting to face the actual ramifications of the murder. It's everything about trying to protect their own skin. Simple as that. And also, because in their minds, these guys are so narcissistic, it's beyond belief. They probably think that they can, now they've had time to get together and decide what their state of play is going to be, somehow outwit the authorities and get away with murder. You know, after all, it was just a bit of legal discipline, wasn't it?
Batool, along with Urfan Sharif and Faisal Shahzad Malik, are coming forward and presenting ourselves. There are a couple of things I would like to address. Firstly, I would like to talk about Sara. Sara's death was an incident. Our family in Pakistan are severely affected by all that is going on. They are harassing my extended family. They have also illegally raided many more of my family members' homes. We have already approached our lawyer, and our lawyer is representing us in Rawalpindi High Court. The next court hearing is on 19th September 2023. My main concern is that the Pakistani police will torture or kill us. That is why we have gone into hiding.
So what you're seeing in that video are two people who are basically trying to manipulate the world. But actually, it's so unsophisticated that it comes off quite the opposite. It comes off quite the contrary. They just look guilty as hell and they look self-serving in nature, which is a terrible thing to do when you're talking about the demise of a beautiful little girl. Now, interestingly, some would say a little bit ironically, really, on the 12th of September 2023, the police raid Mohammed Sharif's home. That's Urfan Sharif's father's home. And guess what they find? Oh, the 5 children are there. Yeah, you know how Sharif's father's saying, I don't know where they are. Don't know where any of them are. Got no idea what's happened. They just popped in and went. Yeah, well, they left the 5 children. So I think you're lying, aren't you? I think you know exactly where they are. I think you knew where they were all along, and you actually have had the children all the time. So there is something BS orientated about this. Now, I will say that the children were described as healthy. They were described as in good condition. So they're obviously being treated well. And a neighbour actually said that the police officers, including female officers, had raided the house. Apparently they broke the CCTV at the entrance and entered it. When they were inside, there were more officers who arrived and stopped the traffic. Apparently they stopped everyone from filming on their mobile phones because, hey, that's the modern time, isn't it? When anything's kicking off, people are just there with the mobile phones. Forget being compassionate, forget trying to help, just get your videos out and hope that you get something viral on TikTok. Now, Mohammed told the BBC he had been hiding the children in his home, but he wouldn't say for how long. He said, I told Urfan Sharif and Beinash Batool that they could go wherever they wanted, but I would not let the children go with you. Until today, no one had asked me about the children. They kept asking me about Urfan, Faisal and Beinash, but no one asked me about the children. I mean, honestly, have you ever heard such absolute mental gymnastics where the truth is concerned? Oh, well, I mean, you were asking me about the perpetrators in this case, who had done horrible things to a child, but you didn't actually directly ask me about where their children were. I mean, if you'd said that, I would have said, oh, all 5 of them are here. But you didn't do that. So I thought, well, you can't possibly be interested in them, so I just won't say anything. I mean, literally, it is just absolutely bizarre to me. Of course, he still denies that he was in touch with his son, denies that he knows where he is. Also, he said that apparently negotiations had been taking place 2 days prior about Sharif coming out of hiding and essentially being handed over to the British authorities. At this point, the children were actually moved to a government childcare facility. There was a court hearing that allowed that to happen. The court didn't actually state how long they should be kept there for. And when you think about child protection services, around the world, actually, they were just expressing relief that the children were safe. But also, there was a hell of a lot of concern about how these kids were mentally, because they'd obviously witnessed and lived with abuse. And also now they'd lost a sister in the most horrendous of ways. Now, UK social services and international welfare organisations actually offered support for the children at this point, saying, you know, they're going to need trauma therapy, they're going to need trauma-informed care, they're going to need psychological assessments. But let me tell you now, they need to be in the UK for that, don't they? And guess where they are? Well, they're not in the UK. And are we going to be able to get them back? Highly unlikely, I would say. But nonetheless, They've got the kids out there. You've got a family who want to keep them. You've got a family who's suggesting, in spite of the way they arrived, that shouldn't indicate that they can't be cared for in Pakistan. I find it really, really worrying that we haven't got those children back, because we haven't so far. Now, at 7:45 p.m. on the 13th of September 2023, Sharif, Batool and Malik were actually arrested at Gatwick Airport. Thank God for that. They'd left Salcott Airport in Pakistan the morning after negotiations with the police and also with British authorities, and they flew back via Dubai. Apparently, they flew business class on the last leg of their journey, which for some reason really annoys me, because I'm pretty sure that they should have been placed, I don't know, where you might hold animals. Just throwing it out there.
I think we're looking for us. We are, yes. Are you okay just to swap over? Just yourself come with me, and if you go with my colleague over there, is that all right?
Nice. Where's your bag? Have you got like a cabin bag?
He does. You know? Yeah. Yes. Which one is your bag?
I don't have any bag.
You have no bag? No. Okay. We'll look overhead. Right, can you put your hands together like that, please? I'll explain more outside, okay?
Sorry?
I'll explain more outside, okay? Right, hold on to him, Yeah, could you just confirm your name for me, please, sir?
Yeah, Urfan Sharif?
Sharif.
Yeah, Urfan Sharif.
Yes, yeah, that's Urfan, okay. So, the time is 1947 hours. The body of Sara Sharif was discovered on the 10th of August 2023 on 6 Hammond Road in Horsell. On the injuries sustained by her and the investigation conducted, you are suspected of her murder. You are therefore arrested for murder of Sara Sharif. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned, something which you later rely on in court, and anything you do say may be given in evidence.
You are therefore arrested for the murder of Sara Sharif. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned, something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand what that means?
From the injuries sustained by her and the investigation conducted, you are suspected of her murder. You are therefore arrested for the murder of Sara Sharif.
A Julum police official stated that they were really relieved to have concluded what they said was a really complicated case. And I have to give it to the Pakistan officials, the Julum officials. They worked really hard. Yes, they may have been a little bit gung-ho and a bit of a maverick with the way that they investigated, but they got the job done. Now, when they returned to the UK, that was actually seen by the investigators here as a real victory, because it involved a lot of cross-border cooperation, and the British police had actually arranged a secure team who was ready to take them into custody immediately upon landing, and that meant there was no opportunity for any escape. There was no legal loopholes that could occur at the airport, and when they arrived, that's exactly what happened. They were immediately arrested and taken for interview, and guess what they did? Bear in mind, guys, this is a group of people who said, we didn't do anything wrong, we're really sorry. At the end of the day, it was just an incident. It was just legal discipline. And we really want to solve this. We want to fight our case in the UK. We've got nothing to hide. They get brought back to the UK because apparently, like I said, they've got nothing to hide. They want to cooperate. And then they get to the interview with the police. And guess what they say? No comment.
Please, could you introduce yourself? What's your name?
So my name is Beinash Batool.
And you are about to be interviewed for the offence of murder. What's your understanding of murder? What's your understanding of that offence?
Killing someone.
Yeah. Okay, so it's intentionally killing somebody. Okay, in very simple terms. Okay, that's the offence for which you've been arrested for, and that's the offence for which we're going to speak to you about. All right. What happened to Sara?
No comment.
What did you see?
No comment.
Whose choice was it? How you left Sara?
No comment.
You know, Dawn's just said, as you said in the video, you want to come back to the UK, clear your name in the UK courts. Well, here we are. This is the start of the process. So why would you not speak to us now?
No comment.
Who did that to Sara?
No comment.
Do you love Sara?
No comment.
Did you care about her at all?
No comment.
2:47 on Thursday the 10th of August, Surrey police received a 999 call from Urfan Sharif calling from Pakistan, asking for the operator to write down his address, which he gave. In this call he stated he killed his daughter and provided her full details. Urfan provided the details of 6 Hammond Road in Horsell, where Sara's body could be found. Police attended the address and discovered the body of 10-year-old Sara Sharif.
तो पुलिस वो उस एड्रेस पे गई थी और उन्होंने उनको उधर उस 10 साल की बच्ची जो है उसकी लाश मिली थी.
We're here because we're trying to find out how Sara died. Who is responsible for her death?
और उसका जिम्मेदार कौन था उसकी मौत का?
No comments.
Okay.
In my view, this little girl was tortured. You were either actively involved in torturing her.
या तो फिर आप इसमें शामिल हैं कि उसके ऊपर जो टॉर्चर सारा जो किया गया है.
Or you were just sat there going, it's not my problem, I can't do anything.
या फिर
and involved in that way.
या फिर आप का ये था कि भाई मेरा मसला नहीं है ये खुद जाने, तो फिर इसमें इस तरह की आपकी शमूलियत है.
No comments.
And when I watched the videos that you've seen, I literally felt a rage that is quite unusual. They come across as arrogant, nasty animals. It's the only way I can describe them. They literally are inhuman to me. Absolutely inhuman to me. And rightfully so, they're questioned with, why have you said you want to help? Why have you said you want to cooperate? And yet you're doing none of that. And of course, the response, as you know, is no comment. It just really gets me somewhere cerebral and visceral when people act this way. Now, all 3 were charged with murder and causing or allowing the death of a child. Batool ended up getting imprisoned at HMP Bronzefield. Sharif and Malik were both at HMP Belmarsh. And these are both high security prisons. And the reason that they were chosen was due to the seriousness of the charges and also the risk of the flight, because if you put them in a low security prison, they could escape and get on a plane. So they wanted them in the highest controlled prisons. They were monitored very closely. And apparently their legal teams prepared to challenge forensic evidence and witness testimonies. Good luck with that, defence teams. Good luck with that. I think you're going to find the prosecution are tight, the prosecution are organised, the prosecution are brutal. Now, in December 2023, there was a plea hearing that took place, and guess what? All 3 pled not guilty to each charge. Not one of them said, you know what, I'm culpable. You know what, I'm accountable. You know what, I'm responsible. Now, those defendants' not guilty pleas genuinely came as no surprise. The police were ready for it. The family were ready for it. Even though this was going to be a really complex trial, everyone was expecting it. At this point, the media interest blew up because everybody, including myself, was awaiting revelations about what the life had been like for the children in the home, why, of course, no intervention that was effective had occurred sooner. And so by the time we got to trial on the 7th of October 2024, we were hungry. We were hungry to find out exactly what had played out. At this point, the jury selection begins. And on the 14th of October, the trial began at the Old Bailey, very, very famous court in the UK, heard some of the biggest cases. The judge was Mr. Justice Kavanagh. And Mr. Justice Kavanagh has presided over some very big cases. And Mr. Justice Kavanagh, shall we say, is pretty old school in his belief systems, and he knows right from wrong in a very appropriate way. This trial was one of the most watched child murder cases in recent history. The courtrooms were packed. They had really strict security. They had an unbelievably heavy media presence. And there were lots of leading child abuse experts who were brought in to provide testimony. And there were these legal teams who were just constantly painstakingly dissecting forensic findings, text messages, and of course, the timeline data, which was going to prove the prosecution's case. Now, they brought in a lot of neighbours who lived around the Sharif family. So Rebecca Spencer, she lived in the flat above the Sharif family between 2018 and 2019. That was at their previous address in Eden Grove Road in Byfleet. Now, she worked from home, so she had a good understanding of what the home was like life-wise for the children. She said, look, I knew that Sharif was a taxi driver. He was usually out during the day. And she also knew that Batool didn't work, so she was home during the day. And she said that she heard noise literally from the Sharif family as soon as they moved in. She said that she heard sounds of crying, of rattling, of door slamming, as well as Batool screaming at the children. And she said that the rattling actually sounded like somebody was locked in a room and was trying to get out. She also said that Sara was always doing chores and she was often looking after the younger kids. You know, Sara was a child. and yet she's got all these chores and these responsibilities, and she's still being beaten in spite of the fact that she's going ahead and carrying those duties out. This particular neighbour described an occasion where she went down to the Sharif flat because the noise, as she put it, was at fever pitch. And so she ends up knocking on the door and says, "Look, is everything all right?" And Batool literally said yes and slammed the door in her face. That describes Batool's personality. Arrogant, nasty, horrible. Now, there's additional insight from this particular woman's testimony. It basically highlighted early red flags that should really have prompted intervention if the authorities had been alerted at the time. These included repeated screaming and door slamming that indicates a real atmosphere of fear and instability, and just general problems in the family dynamics. Then there's Chloe Redwin. She moved into the same flat that previous witness had moved into, so that's once Rebecca had moved out. She lived there from around 2020, the November of that year, until March or April 2023. She said it was always noisy. She was constantly hearing children screaming, and also she heard Batool constantly swearing. So she heard Batool, this is stepmom, stepmom, who the children are telling, "Oh, I don't like my real biological mum, she's like Shrek and an ogre." But actually, it's Batool who's like Shrek and an ogre. She's shouting, "Shut the fuck up and go to your room, you fucking bastard." I'm telling you direct quotes, by the way. I don't like saying those words, but that's what this mother, who was pretending to be a good parent, was speaking like to these children. And this neighbour said that she described sounds of what she thought was smacking and doors being slammed. Again, she reiterated Sara was always doing chores, she was hanging out the washing, she was taking out rubbish. She then said that there was another adult male who moved into the house in December 2022. She identified him as Faisal Malik. She said that he didn't seem to go out very much, so he must have been around seeing all of this abuse playing out constantly. She also said it was in January 2023 that it was the first time she saw Sara wearing a hijab. Now, she asked Sharif about this because it seemed strange that all of a sudden this little girl was wearing a hijab. And Sharif said that Sara wanted to explore her Muslim faith. BS. He wanted to cover the bruises, but this is the excuse that he's giving. Now, as she was giving evidence, Sharif literally had to be giving a warning by the judge because he left court without asking permission. The mark of the man we're talking about. Again, superior, aloof, arrogant. Now, the observations of that neighbour, again, shows that pattern of verbal and physical abuse. It shows the environment that forced Sara into domestic duties that are totally inappropriate for her age. And again, that isolated Sara from getting help because people didn't know what was happening because she was apparently being homeschooled. But essentially, she was an abused Cinderella story to some degree without the happy ending. Now, there were neighbours in Woking who also testified, so the Lazaron family. Now, in a statement from Brennan Lazaron that was read out in court, they said they lived next door to the Sharif family. He said he didn't have a lot of interaction with the children. He always saw Sara in a hijab, and he said he did hear noise from the family in the garden, but apparently once they were in the house, they didn't hear anything. And Judith Lazaron, that's Brian's wife, she told the court that the children were basically always nice, quiet, clean, and quite smart. She said that they seemed like a family unit, that they appeared to be caring parents. She also said, though, that she didn't see Sara nearly as much as the others. So essentially, her testimony isn't very strong because Sara was the child that we're talking about, not the others. Apparently, though, Sara was never smiling, and it was described that there was a separateness from Sara and the rest of the family. She also said that she saw Malik fairly often, but that Sharif had denied that Malik was even living at the house when she asked. So it's really weird and deceptive that they're lying about that reality. Now, she admitted that she was aware that Sara was being homeschooled, and she had been told that same story, that the reason for that was because Sara was being bullied about her hijab. Now, it was testified in court that Sara always wore a hijab and that the only person in the family who did was Sara. And this meant that the neighbour couldn't actually see properly what Sara looked like. Now, when she was cross-examined by Batool's solicitor, somebody called Carberry, they actually talked about Batool being this caring mother with her hands full, and this neighbour was asked to describe an incident where she felt that Sharif had been belittling towards Batool, because obviously the defence for Batool is to make Sharif the monster and that she's just an innocent victim who had to do what he said. Also, there was cross-examination by Malik's counsel, Michael Ivers, who talked about how often she saw Malik, and she said she didn't see him very often. So again, trying to contextualise that, well, you know, did you actually see him do anything wrong? So they're kind of trying to dismantle Batool and Malik's issues here and separate them from the main perpetrator as they see it, which is Sharif. Now, the Lazaron's family testimony, I suppose that paints a more subtle picture, so a more outwardly okay presentation of the family that manages to shield those dark secrets behind the closed doors. So their evidence essentially supports the idea that the outsiders only saw this partial, carefully managed image of the household. Now, Fiona Mellon, this is somebody whose back garden is adjacent to Sharif's back garden. She horrifyingly described hearing a scream. This is about 5 days before she spoke to the police on the 11th of August 2023. She said she heard it around 4:30 or 5 p.m. and she said, I just heard one scream, just for a couple of seconds, and then it just stopped suddenly. She said it sounded like a young female voice, and it was different to Sara's screechy sisters, as she put it. And she said that at that point when she heard it, it took her breath away because it was so out of the ordinary, and immediately she thought to herself, should I just call the police? But then because she didn't hear any further screams, she didn't act. Now, she said that she didn't see the family for the next 5 days. She also described Sara as spirited and outgoing, and said that the last time that she'd seen her physically was in July, and she was wearing a hijab at that point. So that recollection of that sudden singular scream, to me, and I would imagine that people who are expert in this field would agree, that suggests the moment of acute violence. So you don't have the constant screaming noise that indicates that it's going on. It's just that impact in that moment. And that, to me, also indicates that the abuse could really escalate quickly and then quiet down just as fast. And also the injury that could be inflicted could be huge in that single moment. They also brought into the court testimony from the school, the educators who'd worked with Sara. Now, Fatima Chowdhury, she was a learning support assistant at St Mary's Primary School in Byfleet, that was Sara's school. She actually described an incident where she heard Batool shout abuse at two of Sara's younger siblings. Apparently they were being too slow while they were coming into school. I mean, how dare they? How dare children take a little bit of time getting into school? But Batool screams at them, abuses them. Now that shows really poor boundaries. And it also shows that she isn't concerned about other people's opinions, or she feels she has a right to treat these children this way because she's there in the public doing it in front of educators. Now, Fatima, rightly so, made an entry into the Child Protection Online Monitoring System about this, and she said that Batool and Sharif met with the head teacher about the incident, and apparently they both appeared upset, but it was the right thing to do. Now, Helen Simmons, who's Sara's Year 4 and 5 teacher, they described Sara as essentially a really happy child. She said that she was often bubbly. At times she could be sassy. I love that word. I think it's such a cute word for a girl because it means that you're just developing that personality and you're finding out who you are, and you're not just taking what people say to you. You know, you're exploring your own opinions. She also said that she could be very spirited and that she could be bold and fierce with what she wanted to say. I love the description of Sara. What a shame she isn't in this world anymore. She said that also Sara at times displayed attention-seeking behaviours, but of course she did because she was getting horrible abuse at home. She wanted people to notice her. She wanted people to just see her visibly and to acknowledge her presence because she was treated so deplorably in her home environment. Now, in Year 4, this is after the summer half term, Helen received an email to say that Sara would be homeschooled because apparently they were concerned about her progress and also apparently about her friends. She did return in Year 5, but then on the 17th of April 2023, Sharif sent an email saying Sara would be homeschooled again. Now, that teacher still saw Sara at school because when Batool dropped off the younger siblings, Sara would be with her. When we get to the 10th of March 2023, one of the things that Helen, the teacher, notices is a bruise on the underside of Sara's chin and also a cheek that did not appear to look recent, but they could see the bruising. And she questioned Sara on this, and apparently Sara gave very conflicting answers about where it came from. Again, rightfully so, it's referred to the designated safeguarding lead and a social services referrals made by the school. We get to the 28th of March 2023. Batool tells Helen that the bruise on Sara's face had been made by a pen. And Helen said, you know what? It was really odd. It's really strange. She was so defensive. But fortunately, Helen, acting appropriately, refers again to the safeguarding lead. So there's a lot of people saying things are not okay. And the big question is, why on earth isn't this all being followed up? Now, the teacher's concerns clearly evidence a systemic issue. Suspicions are raised. Interventions still didn't prevent the tragedy. So clearly the interventions were not effective. Now, those educators, thank God, must feel a sense of peace within their own actions, but they must feel horrified that the warning signs, in hindsight, warranted more action than was actually given. The jury are also shown, in this case, text messages from Batool to her sisters. Now, those messages, as I said very earlier on in this case, accuse Sharif of beating his daughter up. And that text message continued to say, if something happens to Sara, I will not be able to forgive myself. And in May 2021, she wrote, Urfan beat the crap out of Sara. She's covered in bruises, literally beaten black. I feel really sorry for Sara. Poor girl can't walk. I really want to report him. Now, it seems like originally she had a sense of understanding and empathy towards Sara, but she must have become desensitized or have bought into the abuse at some point, because 2 years on, she's fully engaged in the horror this child is enduring. And it seems ultimately so devastating that at some point she felt bad for this child, but eventually she lost any sympathy and joined in. Now we get to the 8th of November, and again there's more analysis of the messages. Those messages revealed Batool's constant awareness of the ongoing abuse. Yes, she had internal conflicts. Yes, she was fearing that outing the abuse would mean that she would lose somebody she depended on financially. All of these things interplayed into her not reporting it, but all of this led to this little girl's death. And prosecutors, understandably, were also able at this point to point to those texts as evidence of a household dynamic where multiple adults knew of the suffering of Sara, but no one actually intervened. Now, when they bring in the crime scene evidence and all the forensic experts, it is really compelling. So prosecutor Bill Emlyn Jones, he showed jurors images of items found in the Sharif household. He said, you can now look again at the bruises and broken bones Sara had suffered with a clearer understanding of how some of those injuries appear to have been inflicted. Now, just prepare yourself, guys, for what I'm going to go through, because it's horrifying. Police found traces of Sara's blood on the kitchen floor and on a vacuum cleaner. Leaning against a brick outhouse was a cricket bat stained with Sara's blood. Inside the outhouse, police found a rolling pin. Yeah, also had Sara's DNA on it. In a Wendy house in the garden, police discovered a belt which had Sara's, Sharif's and Malik's DNA on it. Also, they found a plastic-coated metal pole which experts matched the shape of bruises Sara suffered. And then discarded in the bins outside the home, police found towels and Sara's leggings soaking wet with urine. Also a soiled nappy that Sara had been forced to wear. My God, this child was tortured, degraded, humiliated, murdered. It goes against everything we imagine is appropriate for a child to experience. And the variety of weapons and the objects used, they show a clear pattern of calculated torment. This wasn't impulsive anger. This was planned. And I'm going to tell you something else that they found, which blew my mind and means that I hope that none of these human beings get to walk freely for the rest of their days. I hope they die in prison. Because they found the presence of taped hoods and restraining devices indicating psychological torture as well as physical abuse. They found bits of plastic bag bound up with parcel tape, which Emlyn Jones described as homemade hoods, which were placed over Sara's face and then taped in place. The hoods were stained with Sara's blood and saliva. Sara's fingerprints were also found on the hood. In the shed at the back of the house, police also found a length of black rope. And guess what? They had hairs ripped from Sara's head within it. They also found more rolls of parcel tape. And Emlyn Jones told that jury that it was Batool who'd bought 12 rolls of parcel tape in July 2023, just 9 days after buying 6 rolls from Amazon. So Batool wasn't a victim. Batool was a perpetrator. The prosecution said, consider for a moment what it would take to keep Sara tied up, taped up, or restrained or hooded in the way that these objects indicate. If this were being done by one of the adults in the house, why aren't the others intervening? Why aren't the others releasing her? Why aren't the others helping her, preventing this terrible treatment? The sheer planning, the frequency of buying the tape, it shows premeditation. It shows a household environment where the abuse was absolutely methodical. Dr. Roland Kubel, he's a dental surgeon and forensic odontologist. He analysed 4 injuries to Sara's left forearm, 1 to her left wrist and 1 to her inner leg and thigh. He concluded they were probably human bite marks. Now, he was given dental impressions of Sharif and Malik, and also Sara's older brother, excluded all 3 of those being responsible. You know who didn't give a dental impression? Batool. Yeah. I mean, if she didn't have anything to hide, she'd have just handed over that dental impression, right? But she didn't. I'll let you decide what that means. The expert also said it was not possible the bites had been self-inflicted. Also said it was very difficult to age the bites because the ones on Sara's arm were older than the one on her inner leg. And bite marks, let's be honest, when it comes down to abuse, they indicate a level of cruelty that goes beyond punishment. They suggest dehumanization. They suggest sadistic intent. Then they bring in Niall Martin, consultant burns surgeon. He analysed the burns Sara sustained on each buttock, and they concluded they were caused in the same incident, a single contact burn that was at least 2 weeks old. Said it was intentionally inflicted and made by a domestic iron. Now, I'm sure lots of you have caught your wrist with an iron or your finger with an iron. It hurts. Imagine having your buttocks burnt with a domestic iron at the hands of an abuser. Imagine the terror, the pain, the agony, and also the chance of infection, because burns can get very badly infected. He also identified several burns on Sara's feet, said that it was likely a scald injury, and said it was likely to have been exacerbated by Sara soiling herself when restrained. So infections getting in there because they're keeping her restrained and tied up and she's soiling herself. Imagine the level of dehumanization I'm talking about for this little girl. They also mentioned evidence of Sara being bound at the feet, said also that would have been deliberate, and not one of those burns was given proper medical attention. And that expert concluded it was highly likely that the deceased girl experienced daily pain and suffering prior to her death. This included what they noted as physical discomfort and psychological suffering. They said that Sara would have literally had to hobble and grimaced or winced if the injuries were touched, and that it would have been obvious to anyone who saw her regularly that she was in agony. Medical experts basically said that any adult in regular contact could not have missed the signs of extreme pain that were essentially coming from those injuries. And that just raises so many moral and legal questions about the collective responsibility in that home. When it comes down to it, even if one person was the perpetrator, there is a collective responsibility in abandoning that child. They made their choices to do so. They are complicit in this child's death. They also bring in Professor Owen Arthurs. He's a consultant paediatric radiologist. He said to the jurors there were multiple unexplained fractures in 25 locations on Sara's body. X-ray images of different fractures shown to the court. Jurors heard estimations of when those actual injuries occurred, and they ranged from 12 weeks to less than 10 days before Sara's actual death. That professor said, my opinion of most of the fractures in this case were that they were very unusual, and they cannot be explained by accidental mechanisms, nor can they be explained as any single high-impact trauma event. He highlighted the fractures to Sara's hyoid bone in the neck, the vertebrae in her spine, and her hand in particular. And they actually said a fracture to the hyoid bone is extremely rare. He said to the jury, I have not ever seen a hyoid fracture in a child, even in those where we have a very good history of ligature strangulation. The most likely cause here is manual strangulation with a degree of force above that which we would commonly recognise in a ligature strangulation or a hanging. Also, the spine fractures, authors said, were likely caused by high velocity impact or multiple trauma. Said that the spinal fractures are very rare and usually caused by road traffic accidents or falling from a height. He said he found no evidence that Sara was suffering from any underlying bone abnormality that could explain these injuries. So he said, that's my opinion, that the most likely explanation for the constellation of injuries, including location, pattern, severity, healing pattern, and some refractures, are multiple episodes of blunt force trauma inflicted over several weeks. Think about it, guys. Those severe skeletal injuries, which absolutely indicate prolonged, repeated violence. This isn't sporadic discipline gone wrong. This is systemic abuse of the highest level. They brought in Professor Anthony Fremont because, believe me, the prosecution were going for it. He was able to identify an abnormality in Sara's bone marrow. Now, the most plausible cause was either starvation or the rapid removal of food. My God. They destroyed this child on every single level, didn't they? Neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, constant torture, starvation or the withdrawal of food, humiliation, degradation, all of these things they were doing to this one little girl. Now, this particular expert ruled out natural diseases, said that that was nothing to do with the cause of Sara's injuries, and again concluded that none of those injuries were accidental. They also said that withholding basic needs like food is, of course, another form of abuse that intensified Sara's vulnerability. Then they bring in Gregory Robinson. Now, he is a cell site analyst. He's got 35 years experience working in radio and telecommunications, and he was able to explain how the movements of a phone can be analysed. So he examined the mobile phone data of all the three defendants. Now, what cell site analysis does is it confirms your movements, and in this case, it confirmed the movements with them leaving the UK, shall we say, hastily, vacating the country hastily, and also provided a really crucial timeline that matched periods of abuse and also attempted cover-ups. So that's compelling testimony. Then they bring in Vernie Govender, the Surrey police analyst. Now, that particular expert presented an hour-by-hour timeline of the defendants' movements in the 3 weeks prior to Sara's death. Now, the 8th of August, that's the day Sara is believed to have died, data actually shows Sharif Batool and one of the other children going to Maybury surgery in the morning. Sharif then goes to Heathrow Airport, makes a series of calls to Batool. Then from around 8:30 p.m, Batool is constantly on the phone. She makes 30 calls to multiple people in around 14 minutes. Then calls Southall Travel to inquire about travel to Pakistan. And that frantic flurry of calls underscores, doesn't it, the defendant's desperation to just escape imminent detection once Sara can't be hidden any longer. They know it's coming. They want to get out of the country ASAP. Now, when it came down to the prosecution's strategy, well, their case was very well built on forensic evidence. Testimony from the neighbours, as I've described, teachers, medical experts, as well as all of those incriminating text messages and phone records. And they do a very good job in court of depicting the defendants as basically working collectively, or at least tolerating each other's actions to perpetuate an utter regime of terror against Sara. The prosecutors emphasised to the jury the systematic nature of the abuse, the improvised restraints, the repeated use of makeshift tools, and of course the total lack of medical care. And they also highlighted Sharif's confession, Batool's knowledge, which is shown in text of the abuse, and Malik's DNA on the instruments of abuse. So what the prosecution did was basically contend that all of the three knew exactly what was happening and did nothing to stop it, or indeed actively contributed towards the abuse. Now, the Crown suggested that after Sara's death, the defendants did flee the UK because they absolutely wanted to avoid accountability, which demonstrate a consciousness of guilt. They know what they did was wrong and they don't want to be done for it. Now, when it came down to the defensive strategy, well, they didn't have one really, but essentially this is how it went. Each of the defendants denied responsibility for causing Sara's death and basically insisted that they never intended to kill her. Sharif's defence team they actually went down the line of saying, listen, he admitted to beating Sara, but you know what? He didn't mean to end her life. He was under extreme stress, or she was provoking him. And so they are basically trying to frame this as excessive discipline gone wrong. You know, it's just one of those things. He was just, excessively beating his child and he killed her. But he didn't really mean to. Is he really a murderer? We don't think so. Well, you know what? The rest of the world do, mate. But this is the way that they've not really got with respect to defence plan. They're not really going to be able to do a good job in this case. They're just going to try to mitigate as much as they can. I get it. They've got a hard job to do because these guys are guilty as hell. But that's the road that they are taking, this discipline gone wrong situation. Now, when it came down to Batool's counsel, of course, we all know what Batool's going to do, aren't we? Oh, poor little me. I'm just a victim. I'm just a poor little lady. I didn't have a choice. I was being controlled by him. Were you? Yes, I was being controlled by him. This is about a nasty man. Weren't you heard when he was completely out of the picture, screaming at the kids constantly? Weren't you heard basically being highly abusive to them? Well, maybe, but that's only because I'm a little submissive lady who has no control. I mean, again, you know why the defence are doing it? Trying to paint her as a victim, hoping they'll get a bit of sympathy. So portraying her as a subservient and fearful woman who lacks the power to intervene or report abuse is the only way that they can go. So they said that she was controlled by Sharif. She didn't want to follow the instructions, but she did. They kind of tried to explain away the incriminating messages as expressions of worry as opposed to complete complicity. And, why did she flee the country if she had nothing to hide? Just throwing it out there. Now, Malik's defence, they just tried to minimise his involvement. They said he was a peripheral figure in the household. He didn't really know what was going on. He wasn't aware of the full extent of the abuse, and he wasn't the person inflicting the injuries. They said that his DNA presence on the items were just due to him sharing a living space, and it wasn't actually an active participation. And I think that that defence is the most obvious one, and probably does give some kind of legs to his defence, because I guess for the jury, it's more palatable to believe that he just didn't really know what was going on and didn't necessarily engage in the abuse itself. I would say he's fully complicit. He was living in a small house and this child was being tortured. But like I said, I think that defence is probably the one that makes the most sense and probably had the most impact with the jury. Now, collectively, the defence also challenged the forensic interpretations, questioned the reliability of neighbours, questioned the teacher's testimony and the recollections, and also attempted to cast doubt on the timeline and severity of the injuries. They basically hinted that some of the injuries might have been accidental or self-inflicted. Because if you're not noting young kids biting themselves in places their heads can't reach, I don't know what you're thinking of. No. And they also hinted that some of the injuries might have been accidental or self-inflicted. So, the suggestion that Sara is going out there going, oh, cricket bat, I'll just smash myself in the head with a cricket bat. Oh, can I contort my body and bite myself in areas that my head cannot reach? Can I fracture major areas of my body? Oh, where's that iron? I might just use it on my buttocks. I mean, the defence is deplorable in my mind, because anybody painting a picture that these are accidental or self-inflicted is trying to minimise the horror that this child went through. And basically, they were also saying that Sara's behaviour was difficult, and if you just understood how difficult she was, maybe you'd understand why he had to legally discipline her in such a way that she got killed. But that's their argument. Now, during this case, there was the cross-examination of the defendants, and when Sharif took the stand, the prosecutors confronted him with his own words from the phone call, the handwritten note, the text messages that showed premeditation. And when he was being cross-examined, Sharif became uncomfortable, very visibly uncomfortable. At times he was contradicting himself because he's a massive liar, but he did constantly try to maintain that he only meant to discipline Sara, never to kill her. I wanted to torture her. I wanted to damage her terribly. I wanted to harm her in the most malicious of ways, but I did not want to kill her. I wanted to be able to carry on abusing her. He may as well have just said that on the stand. He also was unable to explain the prolonged systematic torture. When he was pressed on the improvised weapons, Sharif offered these really vague justifications. He said he had a momentary loss of control rather than sustained violence that was clear for everyone to see. Now, Batool's cross-examination, they focused on her text messages, so these described Sharif's ongoing abuse. The prosecutor rightly asked why she never called the authorities or sought help for Sara, and Batool said that she feared Sharif and insisted she had no control. Of course, they challenged her on the multiple purchases of tape and the presence of the hooding devices. And at this point, Batool was just like she was in the initial police interview. She gave really evasive answers or no answers. She didn't convincingly explain why she didn't stop or report the mistreatment. She did appear a bit tearful at times. She was saying she was trapped, but the prosecution pointed out that she never disclosed abuse to anyone outside the family despite multiple opportunities, so it just didn't add up. Now, Malik's cross-examination, that revolved around his physical presence during key incidents and also, of course, his DNA on the implements used to hurt Sara. Now, he was questioned on why he never intervened, and Malik said, look, I didn't know. I wasn't there. I didn't realise this was happening, and somehow he wasn't present at any of the critical moments. That's his argument. So the prosecution at this point confronted him with the evidence that he was indeed present very often, according to people who were neighbours, and that he had ample chances to help Sara, or at least to alert others to help her. Apparently, Malik offered very few coherent answers. He was very defensive. He said he had no idea how his DNA ended up on the belt or other items. And throughout the cross-examination, all the defendants were just struggling to maintain a consistent narrative. They were always blaming each other, or they tried to paint themselves as powerless bystanders. And the prosecution loved that. It meant they could seize on those inconsistencies. It meant they could emphasise that none of them had sought medical help for Sara's injuries, and also that all three fled the country after her death, meaning none of them felt accountable, none of them wanted to be responsible, and if they could have happily stayed in Pakistan, they probably would have. Now, late November 2024, it's just happened in fact, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts against Urfan Sharif and Beinash Batool for Sara's murder. Faisal Malik was found guilty of causing or allowing Sara's death. And even to that bitter end, Sara Sharif's family was arguing over how much blame each person should shoulder for the horrific abuse and murder. So you had lawyers for her father, Urfan Sharif, who was 42 at the time of him being convicted, and stepmother Beinash Batool, 30, each of them seeking to mitigate their involvement after they're found guilty of the 10-year-old's murder. So you have Naeem Mayan KC, who is working for Sharif, the father in this case, and he called on Mr. Justice Kavanagh, the judge, to consider the case dispassionately, despite the outpouring of public anger, outrage and disgust in the wake of the verdicts. Just going to throw it out there. Don't think that's going to happen. I kind of think that a judge can't be dispassionate when a child's been tortured to death. Just suggesting that KC maybe needs to rethink his strategy. So this KC went on to say, while Sharif accepts responsibility for what he did, there had been no explanation for the horrific burns and bite marks on Sara's body that he had denied inflicting. So basically he's saying, you know, he did a lot of it, but he didn't do all of it. And on Batool's role, Mr. Meehan said, they are equally as culpable and therefore your lordship ought not to draw any distinction between them. So he's basically saying, look, my client clearly is guilty of this, but no more guilty than she is. Now, Caroline Carberry, KC for Batool, she argued that her client played a lesser part in the abuse leading to Sara's death and was apparently subordinate to her husband. But with respect, that doesn't wash with anybody. They said from the start of the relationship, Batool was an isolated and vulnerable woman who had been cast out by her family, the court had heard. Now, if she was cast out by her family, that's an awful thing. I do not understand cultures who do that. I don't get the concept of honour. I don't think that any of that stacks up in the UK, and it shouldn't exist in the UK. It's as simple as that. If you're living in the UK, you should have some Western principles to the way that you bring your kids up, the way you treat your children, and certainly you shouldn't reject your children for making choices you're not happy with, unless those choices are doing something illegal and heinous, in which case I get it. But essentially, if that happened and she was thrown out by her family, I think that's really sad. But that makes me question, why was she texting her sisters, who were clearly offering some kind of support back then, if there was no relationship there? So it doesn't really add up to me. Now, Ms. Carberry said Sharif was a controlling, manipulative and violent man. He was the instigator and the long-term inflictor of the violence on Sara. She said the balance of power lay with him and Batool was expected to put up with his behaviour, she said. Addressing Mr Justice Kavanagh, she also said, the court can find further confirmation from the police and social service records that Urfan Sharif had a history of controlling behaviour and violence towards women and children stretching back many years. She said this is a feature of him about which my lord can be sure. Now, she's right, 100%, but an equally evil person can come into the life of an evil person and become even more evil as a couple, and that's what happened in this case as far as I'm concerned. But that same barrister, Miss Carberry, also said at some point Batool, who had 5 other children and stepchildren, ceased to protect Sara and joined her husband by assisting or encouraging him. She said the court could properly conclude that her will must have been broken by her circumstances. Her determination, which she clearly held for a significant period of time to fight against what was happening to Sara and to do the right thing, morphed into something else. She said Beinash Batool expresses genuine remorse for Sara's unintended death. Let's remember, she called it an incident, didn't she? She didn't say it was an unintended death when she talked about it on that video. She said it was an incident. But anyway, back to what the actual barrister said. She said she has deep personal regrets for remaining in the relationship with Urfan Sharif and true sorrow that she did not remove the children from harm. Well, she didn't. And you know what? Chain of causation. Do the crime, kid. Do the time. When it came down to sentencing, Mr Justice Kavanagh obviously didn't believe that he could be dispassionate. He said that they had both singled out Sara for abuse, amounting to torture. He said that Sharif had done it because Sara was a girl and Batool because she was not one of her own children. How horrific, how hideous. The judge also said while most of the violence was inflicted by her father, Batool also took an active role and was willing to sacrifice her. That's what the judge said, and he was absolutely right. Mr Justice Kavanagh went on to say, it was you who bit her on the arm and on the inner thigh not long before she died. These were not affectionate nibbles. These were bites. Also, I can be sure that you took part in the tying up and hooding of Sara. This was not the work of one individual. And Sara was tied up even when Urfan Sharif was not in the house. Still further, I have no doubt that you were present and involved in the burning of Sara with an iron, which led to the terrible burns on her buttocks. This was a 2-person job. One to hold Sara and one to press the iron onto her body. When it came down to sentencing, he gave Urfan Sharif life imprisonment with a minimum of 40 years. And yes, I'm smiling because that's a hefty sentence in the UK and one that man deserves every second of.
Urfan Sharif, for the murder of Sara Sharif, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Taking account of all the relevant circumstances and the aggravating mitigating factors that I have set out, the minimum term will be 40 years.
Beinash Batool, she got life imprisonment with a minimum of 35 years.
Beinash Batool, for the murder of Sara Sharif, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Taking account of all the relevant circumstances and the aggravating and mitigating factors that I have set out, the minimum term will be 33 years, less the time that you have spent on remand. Whatever your personal predicament and personal circumstances, you should have taken steps to stop this torture of a small child, instead of encouraging and assisting and sometimes participating in acts of extreme cruelty over a long period, knowing that they were very wrong. You are a strong-willed adult, aged 29 at the time of Sara's death, and you were not so cowed by Urfan Sharif's treatment of you that you were effectively prevented from speaking up. You could think for yourself, as is shown by the fact that you did, in 2022, seek advice from a solicitor about a divorce and custody of the children.
Faisal Malik, 20 years for causing or allowing Sara's death. So hefty sentences, and thank God for that. Amen to that. Mr Justice Kavanagh emphasised the gravity and sadistic nature of the abuse, the absolute betrayal of trust and the attempt to evade justice. Legal experts actually said that the sentences finally reflected society's strongest condemnation of crimes against children. And the Children's Commissioner for England says Sara's death highlights the profound weaknesses in the child protection system which we have failed time and again to correct. And I think that's so powerful that the Children's Commissioner is saying that, because that's so true. And Dame Rachel D'Souza said she's haunted by the words used by Sara's father when he said, "I legally punished my child." She calls for change in the laws so the defence that allows reasonable chastisement of children is fully removed. She also calls for a proper oversight of children being educated at home, which I get, as long as it's not used to make more of a nanny state. You have a right to educate your kids at home, and they do it very well, and we should always have that option. I will take that option for my own daughter. But she does say there needs to be homeschool visits. They need to make sure that vulnerable children are being protected, and they need to have better data sharing between the services when it comes down to homeschooling. And they need to have better data sharing between the services so that children who are homeschooled are protected. We all would agree with that. She also said there can be no doubt that Sara was failed in the starkest terms by the safety net of services around her. She added that Sara was known to social services but fell off their radar, and said we can have no more reviews, no more strategies, no more debate. When we say never again, we have to mean it. Let that be Sara's legacy. Powerful, powerful words, powerful statement. I'm not saying it's going to make a difference, because we've heard this before. We heard it with Victoria Klimby, we heard it with Baby P in the UK, but there is something about those words and her actually stating that it's too late now to keep saying those same old tropes where we're going to learn lessons. She's saying not again. Let this be the last case, and let this be the last case. Let this be the last case, guys. God, I hope that. I pray for that. Now, of course, let's not forget Olga, the mother in this case, Dolman, as we've referred to her in this case, but Olga Dolman. She was relieved at the verdict, but she says that she is absolutely overwhelmed with grief, and she's very glad that they received such a severe sentence. Also, a lot of organisations have come out and said that we need reforms in child protection. We do need some stricter homeschooling oversight. We need better interagency communication. Of course, the policymakers did the classic saying that lessons would be learned. But like I said, we don't believe that. But we do believe that with a new Children's Commissioner who's saying, listen, we can't keep apologising for these things. We have to change the outcomes. Maybe, just maybe, Sara Sharif's life will not have been ended in vain. I have so many feelings about this case because of the cultural divide, and I know that there'll be some people who feel angry with the fact that I've come down so hard on cultural differences, particularly with regard to girls and women. I don't care. Sorry. I mean, I'm apologising because it hurts me to know I hurt people, but I don't care. If you think a woman is lesser, if you think a female is lesser, then firstly, you're wrong. And secondly, there is something deeply and profoundly incorrect about your mindset. Children are innocent, beautiful beings who deserve protection at all costs. They are equal. They are miracles. They are what God sent. And they should be treated in accordance with that belief. And they grow into women. And they grow into men. And they are equal again. And they are different. That's what makes them so beautiful, isn't it? Males and females. We are different. There's a lot of us that are the same in so many ways, but we have these distinctions. I birth babies. My husband is far better at DIY, and some of you women will be screaming at the screen saying, I'm great at DIY. Well, I'm not. But you know, for the most part, the guys are building the houses, right? And for the most part, the women are caring for children in different areas, such as nursing and childcare. And you know what? Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it beautiful that that makes us equal in different ways? So, for anybody who's offended by me saying that nobody should push a religion on a child, particularly in a Western environment where there is a mother who is non-Muslim in this case, it's because this is the UK and it should be acknowledged as part of our Western values that children don't necessarily want to go down that path. If we have a scenario where Batool, for example, was rejected by her family for whatever reasons, that's appalling, particularly if it's cultural, and that needs to stop. We need to stop saying that all cultures are equal. They're not. If you do not treat people on an equal footing, your culture is not equal to one that does. If a child can be disciplined in a violent way and it's accepted in certain places, that makes it less than a culture that refuses to do so because we believe in the safeguarding of children. I have no problem saying that. And for those people who will be rare, who come to my channel and are offended by that, that's okay, because I'm in the UK and I get to offend, and you get to offend me too. Write something nasty in the comments. It doesn't matter. That's the beauty of our freedom. And children, more than any, should have the ultimate freedom to live their lives safely in a loving environment, protected by people who have their best interests at heart. For Sara Sharif, that didn't happen. The torture, the arduous nature of the agony she endured is despicable. I hope both of those people die in prison. And just like all of the perpetrators I've talked about in these kind of cases, I treat all of them with equality. I wish hell and damnation and the furious fires of hell for eternity on all of them. My final words are, let's remember Sara Sharif. Let's remember that beautiful girl with a beaming smile, with a sassy nature, who to all intents and purposes was failed on every single level. Let's just remember her for those minutes that we can in our busy lives and take her face with us for the rest of our lives. Let's hope her death really does create change. See you again next time, guys. I hope I've done this justice. Lots of love.